I poured myself a second cup of coffee before sitting back down at the kitchen table. My son-in-law was already talking. He had been talking for about 10 minutes straight, and I had learned, over the past 2 years of living under his roof, that the best thing to do when he started was to let him finish. Interrupting only gave him more energy. My daughter sat beside him, her hands folded on the table. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the sugar bowl. "The numbers just don't work anymore, Dad," my son-in-law said. "His name is Cody. He sells commercial real estate and has a handshake that could crack a walnut, and he has never once in 12 years asked me a question he didn't already have an answer to. With the mortgage, the utilities, the property tax, we're stretched thin. Sylvia and I have talked about it. We think it's fair that you contribute." I wrapped both hands around my mug. The coffee was still hot. "Contribute," I said. $1,400 a month, he said, which, honestly, for a basement suite in Oakville, is below market. You know that. I did know that. I also knew it wasn't a basement suite. It was the lower level of the home my daughter and I had purchased together. My name on 40% of the deed, my retirement savings making up the difference her and Cody's mortgage couldn't cover. I knew all of that. I had the documents to prove every dollar of it. I smiled at him the way you smile at someone who has just told you it's going to rain and you already have an umbrella in your bag. "Let me think about it," I said. He looked surprised. He'd expected pushback, I think. Or tears. Something he could work with. "Sure," he said. "Of course, take a few days." That night, after they'd gone to bed, I sat at the small desk in my room and opened the accordion folder I kept in the bottom drawer of my dresser. I'd started keeping it 2 years ago, the month I moved in. At the time, I told myself I was just being organized. I was 63 years old and recently widowed, and my daughter had offered me a room, and I had said yes, because I didn't know what else to say. But some instinct I'd carried through 31 years of working as a claims adjuster, told me to keep records. So I did. My wife, Marguerite, passed in the spring of 2021. Pancreatic cancer, from diagnosis to the end, was 11 weeks, which the doctors told us was actually faster than average, as if that were a comfort. She was 61. We'd been planning to spend her first year of retirement driving the Trans-Canada, stopping wherever we felt like stopping. We had a list on the fridge: Peggy's Cove, Lunenburg, Gross Morn. The list is still on my fridge. I took it with me when I sold the house in Guelph. Sylvie is our only child. She was 34 when her mother died. She'd been married to Cody for 6 years by then, and they had the house in Oakville and were talking about starting a family. A few months after the funeral, she called me on a Sunday afternoon and said she'd been thinking, and she didn't like the idea of me rattling around in the Guelph house alone, and what did I think about moving closer? I want to be honest about something. I wasn't tricked. Not entirely. I chose to move in, and I chose to put my name on that deed, and I chose to contribute my money. I was lonely and grieving, and my daughter was offering me a family to belong to. I am not telling this story to make myself sound helpless, because I was not helpless. Because I was not helpless. I was hopeful. There's a difference. We sat down with a real estate agent that fall. Sylvie and Cody's house had appreciated since they bought it, but they needed more space if they were going to have children, and Cody had found a property in Oakville, a 4-bedroom with a finished lower level on a ravine lot that he said was a once-in-a-decade find. Their approval limit at the bank was $180,000 short of the asking price. I had $310,000 in RRSPs that I'd rolled over after Marguerite passed. I also had the equity from the Guelph house once it sold. We sat with a financial advisor, Cody's financial advisor, I should say, and worked out an arrangement. I would contribute $215,000. My name would go on the deed at 40%. The lower level would be my living space, and the understanding was that it would remain my living space for as long as I needed it. There was no formal agreement beyond the deed. Cody said a formal agreement would be insulting, given that we were family. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to say. I didn't push it. The first year was fine. Better than fine, actually. Sylvie and I would have coffee in the mornings before Cody left for the office. I helped with things around the house. The kind of help that doesn't have a dollar value, but that a household notices when it's gone. I drove Sylvie to appointments when Cody was busy. I assembled furniture. I resealed the driveway in August because Cody had gotten 3 quotes and told me all 3 were highway robbery. I was useful, and being useful helped with the grief. The second year was different. Cody had a good stretch at work. A big commercial deal closed in January, and he bought a new truck, and then he started talking about a renovation. He wanted to convert the main floor office into a proper dining room and expand the kitchen. I sat in on the early conversations because it was my house too. Then one day the contractor came by for a walkthrough, and I realized I hadn't been invited. Sylvie looked uncomfortable when I came upstairs. Cody said they'd fill me in later. They did fill me in later. The renovation would cost more than they expected. They were looking at options. One of the options, apparently, was to refinance. I found this out not from them, but from a letter that arrived addressed to Sylvie and Cody from their mortgage lender, congratulating them on the approval of their refinancing application. I set it on the kitchen counter and waited. Cody came home at 6:30. He glanced at the envelope. He said they'd been meaning to mention it. How much? I asked. $85,000, he said. It's a good rate. The renovation will add value to the property. I asked him if he'd considered that I owned 40% of that property, and that taking on additional debt against it without my knowledge or consent was something I might have had thoughts about. He said he'd assumed I wouldn't mind, given that I was living there rent-free. That was the first time he used that phrase. Rent-free. I filed it away. I called my brother Gordon, the only person from my old life I talked to regularly. He lives outside of Kingston, runs a small electrical contracting business, and has very little patience for nonsense. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment. You're on the deed, he said. 40%. Then they can't refinance without your signature. I know, but they did. Another silence. You kept the original closing documents? He asked. I have everything. Good, Gordon said. Don't say anything else to them yet. Get a lawyer. I already had a name, a woman I'll call Victoria, because that's her name. Victoria Asamoah, a real estate lawyer in Mississauga who'd been recommended by a colleague of Marguerite's. I'd looked her up the night the refinancing letter arrived. I hadn't called yet. I was still hoping I was wrong about what was happening. I was not wrong about what was happening. 2 days after the conversation about the refinancing, Cody placed a printed spreadsheet on the kitchen table during breakfast and slid it across to me. He said he and Sylvie had been putting together something to help clarify expectations going forward. He said it in the voice he uses when he's pretending that an idea just occurred to him, when you know he's been rehearsing it. The spreadsheet was organized by category. There was a line for housing, $400 per month. A line for shared utilities, $180. A line for what he called property maintenance contribution, $75. At the bottom, in bold, a monthly total of $1,655. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at her phone. Sylvie, I said. She looked up. She had the expression of someone who has agreed to something they knew was wrong and has now decided the only way through is forward. I recognized it. I had watched her wear that expression at 15 when she let a friend talk her into something she shouldn't have done. And I'd watched her wear it at 22 when she'd stayed in a bad relationship 3 months longer than she should have. I knew that face. We've both been feeling the pressure, she said. Financially. You refinanced for $85,000, I said, without my signature on the documents. Cody said the bank had processed it based on Sylvie's ownership stake. He said the way the title was structured gave her full authority to act. I said nothing. I made a note of exactly what he'd said, the way I used to note what claimants said on the phone before they knew I was writing it down. That afternoon, I called Victoria. Victoria is a small woman with a very direct manner and an office full of plants. She sat across from me at her desk, read through the documents I'd brought, and then folded her hands and told me what I already suspected. The refinancing should not have proceeded without my consent. 40% ownership was not a passive interest. I had co-ownership rights and obligations, and the bank's processing of the application without my signature was, at minimum, an administrative error, and potentially something more serious if my signature had been replicated. She used the word replicated. She said she'd like to request the mortgage documents from the lender to review the signature page. I told her about the spreadsheet. The $1,655 per month. She wrote something down. She asked me what outcome I was looking for. I told her I wanted what was mine. I told her I wasn't interested in punishing my daughter. I told her I understood that Cody was the architect of this, and that Sylvie had let herself be convinced, and that I wanted a solution that didn't require me to destroy what was left of my family if I could avoid it. Victoria nodded. She said she'd be in touch. I did not say anything to Sylvie or Cody about the lawyer. I went about my days. I agreed to pay $300 a month toward utilities, which I framed as a gesture of goodwill. Cody accepted this with an air of magnanimity that I found genuinely impressive. He really did believe he was winning. I started looking at condos, not seriously, not yet, just to know what was out there. There was a development going up in Burlington, a 15-minute drive from where my brother lived, reasonable prices for the area, a waiting list that was moving. I put my name on the list. I told no one. Victoria called me 3 weeks later. She had received the mortgage documents from the lender. The signature on the co-ownership consent form was mine. My name, my date of birth, my address. It was not my signature. The letter forms were close, but they weren't right. She'd had a document examiner take a preliminary look. He agreed. The signature had been copied, not written. She asked me how I wanted to proceed. I told her to proceed the way she thought was right. She said she would send a formal letter to the mortgage lender and to my son-in-law, notifying them of the disputed signature and the co-ownership rights, and requesting that the refinancing proceeds be held pending resolution. She said this would not be a quiet letter. I said I understood. I was in the backyard when Cody got home that evening. I was doing nothing in particular, standing near the fence, looking at the ravine, which was full of birch trees that had just started to turn. I heard the truck door close. I heard him go inside. I heard, a few minutes later, what sounded like a chair scraping the kitchen floor. I took my time coming inside. Cody was standing at the kitchen island. He had the letter in his hand. Sylvie was sitting at the table, and when I came in, she looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face since she was a child, and had done something she couldn't undo. It was not anger. It was something closer to relief, the way people sometimes look when a thing they've been afraid of finally arrives and they realize they can stop being afraid. "You hired a lawyer," Cody said. "I did," I said. This letter is saying my signature was forged." "The letter says the signature on the consent form is being disputed," I said. "That's accurate." He put the letter down. He was very still for a moment. "We can work this out," he said, "as a family." I told him I was open to that and that my lawyer would be happy to participate in any family conversation, and that the first step would be the mortgage lender placing the refinancing proceeds in trust while we sorted out the co-ownership question. He didn't like that. He said placing funds in trust would affect their credit position. I said I understood, and that I was sorry, and that I hoped we could resolve things quickly. I went downstairs. I made myself dinner. I was not as calm as I am making this sound, but I was calmer than I expected to be. Sylvie knocked on my door after 10 o'clock. She sat on the edge of the chair by the window, the one Marguerite used to sit in when she read, and she didn't say anything for a while. I waited. "I didn't know he was going to do the signature," she said. "I want you to be clear on that." "Okay," I said. "I knew about the refinancing. I agreed to it. I told myself your name being on the deed was just that it was technical, that you'd be fine with it." She stopped. I convinced myself of a lot of things this past year. I told her I knew. I told her that was the part that had hurt most. Not the money, not the spreadsheet, not even the signature. The convincing herself. The looking at the sugar bowl. She started to cry. I let her cry for a while, and then I made tea, And we talked until almost midnight, not about the legal situation, not about the money, about her mother, about what the second year of grief does to a person, which is different from the first year, and something no one warns you about how much I missed Marguerite, about how much she did too. I did not tell her about the Burlington condo. That wasn't the right moment. The legal process took 4 months. Victoria was methodical and precise and absolutely unbothered by the delays Cody's lawyer introduced. The document examiner filed his report in January. The signature on the co-ownership consent form was not consistent with my genuine signatures across multiple verified documents. The mortgage lender, facing its own liability exposure, moved quickly after that. There were uncomfortable conversations about how the error, the lender chose to call it an error, had been processed without due diligence. In the end, the refinancing was restructured. My co-ownership position was formally recognized. The proceeds that had already been dispersed and spent on the renovation were addressed through a payment plan. Cody's payment plan, not mine. Victoria also negotiated a formal co-ownership agreement, the one we should have signed 2 years earlier, that outlined my rights clearly and in writing and with no ambiguity whatsoever about what 40% actually meant. I signed the agreement, and then I gave my notice. Not out of anger. I want to be clear about that. I gave my notice because the Burlington condo had come available sooner than expected, a corner unit on the 8th floor, and because I had realized sometime during those 4 months that what I actually wanted was a home that was entirely mine, not 40% mine, not mine by arrangement, mine. I told Sylvie first on a Sunday morning in February. I told her before I told Cody. She sat with it for a minute, then asked me if she could help me move. I told her I'd like that. Cody and I have not spoken much since. We are polite at family occasions. I believe, in his version of the story, I am the villain, the father-in-law who lawyered up instead of working things out like family. I have made my peace with that. A man who could convince himself that using another person's signature was a processing error is capable of convincing himself of almost anything. Sylvie calls me on Sundays now. Sometimes we talk for an hour. She and Cody are still together. That's her life and her choice, and I will not pretend I don't hope things improve between them, because she's my daughter, and I love her. But she also told me, a few months after I moved out, that she'd started seeing a therapist. She said she was working on the part of herself that looks at the sugar bowl when she knows something is wrong. I thought that was a good thing to be working on. I'm writing this from my kitchen table on the 8th floor of a building that smells like fresh drywall and possibility. The Staint, Lawrence, is not visible from this window. I'm too far west for that, but on clear days I can see the escarpment. And in the mornings the light comes in at an angle that Marguerite would have liked. I keep her list on the fridge. Peggy's Cove, Lunenburg, Grows Morn. I'm still going to drive the Trans-Canada. Maybe not this year. Maybe in the spring. When people ask me what I would have done differently, I tell them, get everything in writing. Not because you don't trust your family. Because you do. Because the things we do and trust are the ones we most need to be able to look at clearly later, when trust has become complicated by money and grief, and the quiet pressures that accumulate in a shared house over 2 years. And keep the folder. The accordion folder, in the bottom drawer. Keep the documents and the dates and the letters and the notes from phone calls. Not because you're expecting trouble. Because you love your daughter. And because you learned 31 years into a career of sorting out other people's mistakes, that hope and preparation are not opposites. They are, when you get it right, the very same thing. People ask me sometimes whether I regret moving in with my daughter and her husband. They expect me to say yes. It would make for a tidier lesson. Old man makes a mistake, pays for it, warns others. But the honest answer is more complicated than that. I don't regret moving in. I regret moving in without a piece of paper. There's a version of those 2 years that could have gone differently if I had sat down with a lawyer before I signed anything, before I handed over $215,000 and my name on a deed and the quiet assumption that family meant safety. The whole story changes, not because Cody is a fundamentally different person, but because people behave differently when the boundaries are written down. That's not cynicism. That's just something I learned in 31 years of reviewing claims. Clarity doesn't ruin relationships. Ambiguity does. What I've come to understand is that what happened wasn't inevitable. It was the result of a series of small choices, mine and theirs, that accumulated over time until they became a situation none of us could easily walk back from. I chose to trust a verbal understanding. Sylvie chose to look at the sugar bowl. Cody chose to interpret my generosity as passivity. Every one of those choices had a consequence, and the consequences arrived on schedule, the way they always do. I'm not angry about it anymore. I was, for a while, not the loud kind of angry, more the quiet, sleepless kind that sits with you at 2 a.m. and replays conversations. What I kept coming back to during those months was Sylvie's face when I walked into the kitchen and she realized the letter had arrived, that expression I recognized from when she was 15. She knew. She had known for a long time, and she had stayed quiet because staying quiet was easier than the alternative. That's the part I think about most, not the forged signature, not the spreadsheet, not the $1,655 a month for a home I part-owned. The staying quiet. Because I understand it. I do. Grief makes you pliable. It makes you want to hold on to what you have, and if holding on means not making waves, you stop making waves. I had done my own version of it that first year when I told myself the refinancing conversation could wait. The tricky thing about letting things slide is that they don't actually slide. They accumulate. What pulled me through wasn't bravery, and it wasn't anger, and it wasn't some grand decision to fight back. It was the accordion folder in the bottom drawer. It was 31 years of professional habit that had taught me, quietly and without drama, to write things down, to keep the documents, to note what people say when they think you're not paying attention. That habit, that small, unglamorous discipline, turned out to be the most important thing I brought into that house. Sylvie told me she started seeing a therapist, that she's working on the part of herself that goes quiet when she knows something is wrong. When she told me that, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Pride. Not because she's fixing something I needed her to fix, because she identified something true about herself and decided to do something about it. That takes more courage than most people realize. I think about Marguerite often when I sit at this kitchen table. She was the braver one, in most things. She would not have waited as long as I did, but she also would have told me, at the end of it, that the point was never the house. The point was knowing what you're worth and being willing, eventually, to stand up and say so. I'm still learning that. At 65, in a corner unit in Burlington, with the escarpment out the window and her list still on my fridge. It's not too late to learn it. That's the thing I'd most want someone to take from this.